Welcome to today's webinar from Burns and Associates and Coleman Insights. We're excited to share with you some new research on social FM, a hot radio format in Canada that we believe will capture more attention in the United States and beyond in the very near future. Over the next 20 minutes or so, we will present our findings to you, and then we will lead a Q&A session. You could submit your questions at any point during the session by typing them into the meeting platform through the panel you should see on the right side of your screen. And at the end of our presentation, we will answer as many of them as we can. My name is Warren Kurtzman, and I'm the president of media research firm Coleman Insights.
And I'm Alan Burns, the founder of radio consultancy Burns and Associates. You won't be surprised to learn that in our consulting work and in the research Coleman Insights conducts for its clients, radio stations are contemplating and investigating ways to compete in an increasingly competitive environment. This is especially true for music radio stations, as consumers have a wide array of other options for listening to music, including digital streaming platforms that offer them more control and commercial-free experiences. While both of our firms have consistently espoused the value of compelling, entertaining personalities for our music radio station clients, the need for stations to provide content that consumers can't get anywhere else is greater than ever. One station that's succeeding at that is in Edmonton, Alberta. You can say that clearly, Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Of course, it's not a client of either of our firms, but its success intrigues Warren and me, and it serves as the bellwether for the hottest format in Canada, as Warren said, which we at Burns and Associates are calling social FM. If you're not familiar with Now Radio, let me tell you a little bit about it. First of all, it's a ratings monster. According to Numeris, the major provider of radio ratings in Canada, it's been Edmonton's #1 station among 25-54 adults for 38 of the last 40 quarters, consistently leading in men and women. This is no flash in the pan. Now Radio has been a dominant force in the Edmonton radio market for a decade now. This has led to the format's spread into other major Canadian markets. The owners of the Edmonton station launched similarly formatted Today Radio in Calgary in 2019, and Now Radio in Winnipeg in 2021. And another ownership group introduced the format branded as Today Radio in Toronto this past February. Now Radio in Edmonton features a large air staff of foreground personalities, with the widely successful Crash and Mars show anchoring Morning Drive. The content these personalities offer is based on extensive interactions with listeners and is deeply rooted in storytelling. This is not typical morning show content extended to other day parts. Instead, it's listeners telling interesting stories in response to questions asked by engaging hosts. When its personalities are not delivering content, the station plays a mix of hot AC music that's broad from an era standpoint relative to many other hot ACs. Outside of Morning Drive, Now Radio typically plays about 11 songs an hour. To give you a little more detail on that music mix, Warren and his team at Coleman completed a major monitor analysis of a typical weekday on Now Radio. This analysis, which is based on what the station played between 6 a.m. and 7 p.m. on May 18th, shows that contemporary pop is the most exposed sound on the station, making up 27% of the music mix. Other prominent sounds on the station include early to mid-10s pop titles at 15%, contemporary pop alternative at 10%, early to mid-10s pop alternative at 10%, and contemporary rhythmic pop at 9%. These first 5 sounds make up more than 2/3 of Now Radio's mix, but the station blends in some older titles from the 2000s and the 90s to give it some significant era breadth. You can see that era breadth in this next slide, which breaks down how much music Now Radio plays across each of the time periods, listing across the bottom of the screen. The station's average era, which is calculated by averaging together the year of release of each song it plays, is 2013.9. While you see that the bulk of songs listeners will hear when they tune into Now Radio have been released since 2010, you can also see that about 20% of the station's music mix is older than that. With that introduction to Now Radio complete, I'll turn things back over to Warren to tell you a little bit more about the research we conducted on the station.
Thanks, Alan. To gain insights into what is driving the success of Now Radio, we conducted online interviews with 100 randomly recruited consumers in Edmonton between the ages of 18 and 49, each of whom told us on an unaided basis that they listened to Now Radio in a typical week. From each respondent, we collected age and gender data, as well as information on their radio listening habits. We asked these listeners a series of questions, including closed-end quantitative questions and open-ended verbatim-based qualitative questions. To answer the questions that required verbatim responses, our research participants typed their responses, or they recorded and uploaded videos of themselves. Now let's share with you a little bit about what we learned. We'll start with a quick overview of the listenership data we collected. Keeping in mind that this is a study where every respondent was required to be a weekly CUME listener to Now Radio, we wanted to learn a bit about what other stations in Edmonton these respondents were also most likely to report listening to. The blue bars on this chart reveal what percent of Now Radio's weekly CUME listeners are CUME listeners to other stations in Edmonton. Among our respondents, Now Radio shares more CUME with Virgin Radio, a CHR formatted station, than any other, with 45% of its listeners also listening to Virgin Radio. The other stations Now Radio shares a lot of CUME with are a rock station, The Bear, at 34%, followed by CHR formatted KISS at 32%, alternative formatted Sonic at 31%, and Country 103.9 at 23%. What really stands out in the listenership data, however, is how well Now Radio converts CUME listeners into weekly P1 listeners. At Coleman Insights, we use 40% as the benchmark for CUME conversion. So the fact that Now Radio converts 54% of its CUME listeners into P1s is especially impressive. Incidentally, this lines up well with what we observe in the Numeris PPM data. While Now Radio has a sizable CUME audience, its success is driven by its ability to generate a lot of TSL from those who CUME the station. The tan bars on the screen also provide some insights into the P1 behavior of those who listen to Now Radio, but aren't converted into P1s. 11% of Now Radio's CUME listeners are P1s to Country 103.9, with another 9% being P1s to Virgin Radio. And P1s to The Bear, KISS, and Sonic, each making up 6% of Now Radio's CUME listeners. Now, as we revealed in the previous slide, Now Radio converts 54% of its CUME listeners into P1s. We do observe, however, its ability to do this varies somewhat by age and gender. For example, the 35 to 49-year-old Now Radio CUME listeners are more likely to be converted into P1s of the station than are the 18 to 34-year-olds, by a margin of 59% to 49%. The gap is even bigger with men and women, with 64% of the males naming Now Radio as their weekly P1 station versus 46% among females. We should be clear that this does not mean that the appeal of Now Radio's format leans older or male. These figures just show that older and male CUME listeners to the station are more likely to be converted into P1s. With that said, the station's CUME conversion rates with younger listeners and women are also well above our 40% benchmark. For the next set of findings, I'll turn things back over to Alan.
Thanks, Warren. Perhaps the most striking finding was how passionate many of these listeners are about Now Radio. This was reflected in their answers to several of our questions and is summarized in this word cloud, where you can see many positive adjectives being used by a lot of listeners to describe the station. You'll note that many references are to the station's music and hosts, a topic we'll delve into in more detail in just a minute. But you'll also see words like great and fun, love, and interesting being mentioned. You can also feel that listener passion in the way some of our video respondents shared their thoughts about the station.
"102.3 Now Radio is a hilarious radio station with amazing music. It's a must listen to. Absolutely. Best radio station, hands down."
Now Radio is a great radio station to listen to and be a part of the conversation and feel like you're actually a part of their radio family.
You should listen to this radio station now.
Tune in and you will enjoy this radio station.
The place where you can have fun talking about nothing all day.
Listen to 102.3 Now Radio. Great hosts, great music, and it'll never make you want to switch the channel again.
I would say Now Radio is just a great station to listen to, really.
And it makes you feel really good.
Listeners are clearly excited about Now Radio to an extent that we don't often see from many other radio stations.
We asked our respondents whether they primarily listen to Now Radio for the music the station plays, the conversations between its hosts and listeners, or for both the music and the conversations. This is a question we ask in many plan developer perceptual studies at Coleman Insights, and for most music stations, including those stations that have highly successful morning shows, we usually see music cited by the majority of listeners as their primary reason for listening. This is not the case, however, among Now Radio CUME listeners, 55% of whom cite both music and conversations as the primary drivers of their usage of the station. A third of the station's CUME, 33%, says music is the primary reason they listen to Now Radio, while 12% cite the conversations between the hosts and listeners as their primary reason for listening. This varies slightly between 18 to 34-year-olds and 35 to 49-year-olds, with younger listeners a bit more likely to say both than the older listeners. Male listeners are more likely than females to say both, although both is the leading response among both genders. Where the dichotomy is most interesting is between Now Radio's P1 listeners and those who CUME the station but are not converted into P1s. An overwhelming 70% of the station's P1s cite both as their primary reasons for listening, with the rest nearly evenly split between those selecting music and those selecting conversations as the primary reason. Conversely, among other P1s in Now Radio's CUME audience, music at 52% is the biggest driver for using the station. In a similar vein, the majority of Now Radio listeners mention music and personality content when asked to describe the station on a verbatim basis. 54% mention music and conversations and/or hosts in their descriptions of Now Radio, while 30% exclusively speak about the music, and only 11% only mention the hosts and conversations. This pattern is consistent between younger and older listeners and between male and female listeners. But once again, we see stark differences between the station's P1s and non-P1s. Among Now Radio P1s, 63% of the descriptions include references to the music the station plays and to the conversations the hosts have with their listeners, with 19% mentioning music only and 15% mentioning conversations only. Music-only descriptions, however, are more likely among the other P1s in the sample, making up 43% of the mentions, which is tied with the 43% whose descriptions include both music and conversations. Here are some of our respondents using music and conversations in their descriptions of Now Radio.
Good music, entertaining conversations, I guess. There's interesting topics and stories that you'll hear on the radio as you're just driving around, which is great.
I like the hosts and the music, and most of all, they're funny, and they make you want to keep listening.
Well, it's current popular music. You got your Sharon and your Biebs and enough variety that you don't hear the same song 4 times in 4 hours, because that would be really irritating. And also the chit chat's super funny to the point where I oftentimes forget that I usually just skip to another channel when there's commercials. So
Now Radio plays great music from new pop to oldies. I really like the hosts and the conversations that they have. They're very entertaining.
The hosts are absolutely hilarious. The music is awesome. It's always, just a variety of music.
I listen to Now Radio every single day. I love the hosts. I love the music. I love everything that they talk about. They make the Now family feel like they're a part of the whole radio team.
They have a mix of good, new, and old music, as well as really good conversation.
Warren just cited a lot of evidence that the combination of music and conversation is key to the success of Now Radio. And we see very clear evidence of the importance of the host to the station's success. In fact, the frequency with which the station's listeners mention the host is striking. Let me share with you some of the responses we received to the question, what do you like the most about Now Radio? A 43-year-old female P1 to Now Radio answered, the host. They're fun and engaging, and they are so warm to all the people who call in. A 26-year-old male P1 to Now Radio said, I love the Crash and Mars show. It's my alarm in the morning because I love the content they talk about and the music they play. They know how to start off the morning with a laugh and fun and engaging content. A female P1 who's 42 years old said, the interpersonal relationships between the hosts. Love when Rachel Day and the Ginge are on the air together, and Haley is hilarious. We even see enthusiasm for the hosts among those who are not P1s to Now Radio. A 37-year-old female who is an other P1 answered, I like the conversations that are had on the station. The topics are usually great, and they encourage their listeners to join the conversation. Let's look at a little bit more video now to hear directly from our respondents about this passion for the hosts on Now Radio.
The hosts are just very personable, and they're real people without being fake. They have real conversations. They're not foolish.
Different topics, current, like actual topics, things that happen in real life, and they just make it fun every day.
Now Radio is quite the great station to listen to. It allows you to be a part of the conversation. It seems like you get to know the host and be a part of their lives.
And I also like how their conversation is always interesting, so it kind of keeps me on their station.
I think what I like most is the dynamic between the hosts for the shows. It just seems really organic, and they're really funny, really entertaining, but definitely keeps you engaged.
What I like the most about Now Radio is the hosts and the topics that they talk about, because they relate to you so much. It makes you want to keep listening.
And finally, we want to talk about listeners' perceptions of the music Now Radio plays. The key term here is era variety, as an overwhelming 47% of the verbatim responses listeners gave to the question, how would you describe the music on Now Radio, made some reference to variety. Here's some examples of how they described the music. A 45-year-old woman who is not a P1 to Now Radio said the station offers current pop and songs from 10 to 20 years ago. A 27-year-old male who's a Now Radio P1 said, I think it's a great variety of current hit songs and also a blast to the past for hits that really take you back. Either way, it's bangers all around. A 29-year-old female who's a P1 listener to another station said, the music is good because you have a wide variety of options to listen to, rather than the same 6 songs on repeat like many other stations. Some of the responses we received suggest a minor element of surprise with Now Radio's music mix. For example, this 25-year-old male who is not a P1 to the station said, sometimes the same music and sometimes new music. You never know what's going to come on.
While what we have shared with you today is a look at only one station executing social FM, and more extensive research needs to be done on the format, Alan and I feel strongly about 2 major implications of our findings. First, it is vital that stations that offer social FM develop images for music and conversations. For those of you who are well acquainted with Coleman Insights image pyramid, this means that the base of the pyramid for social FM outlets consists of a blend of music and personality. This also means that stations that focus exclusively on one versus the other will not realize the potential of the format, as music is what brings CUME to social FM stations, and compelling conversations between hosts and listeners generates TSL. Stations that only develop images for music will not perform well against more strongly imaged music stations in their markets. Stations that only develop images for conversations will struggle with limited CUME appeal. A second implication of our findings is that you need to have the right horses to run this race. Social FM stations must hire, invest in, and develop hosts who are adept at listener interaction and telling stories. We are confident that Now Radio in Edmonton would not be nearly as successful without many of the hosts, such as Crash and Mars, Ginge, Rachel Day, and Haley, who listeners mentioned to us on an unaided basis in this study. Now, in a couple of minutes, Alan and I will take your questions, which I remind you can be submitted by typing them directly into the meeting platform. Before we do, we invite you to read the 2 blog posts Alan and I co-authored that appeared in Tuesdays with Coleman over the last 2 weeks. You can access those for free at colemaninsights.com. Furthermore, the blogs are also available at the Alan Burns and Associates website, burnsradio.com. Thanks for joining us today. Alan and I are now ready to take your questions. All right, Alan, while I am looking through some of these questions that have come in for us here today, I'm going to pull up a couple of these. Here's a good question to start with. What is unique about the personalities on this station? How are they different from the personalities I'll hear on other music stations? Alan, I'll let you take that one.
Thank you, Warren. Well, first of all, they don't function as music jocks. They're more storytellers and stage setters for the audience. They need to be warm, genuine people who know how to listen and how to hold a conversation. And the reason for the storyteller is that stories are key to this concept. You know, humans are hardwired to tell and listen to stories. We've done it since there was ever a language. You know, if you think about it, every movie or TV show or book you ever loved, and most of the songs you love are stories. So the host has to be able to tell a story, and then the listeners tell theirs. Fortunately, there's a process for telling and getting good stories from the audience, and coming up with what's required, which is an almost limitless supply of the right stimulus to generate audience stories, is really one of the biggest challenges to doing this right. You know, one good thing is that when you do it right, the audience generates most of the content.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that always strikes me when I listen to this station. Yeah. It doesn't sound like the personalities I'll hear on other music stations. It's a different and unique approach, and I think that's an important thing for people to understand about the format.
Yeah.
Another question that we got here, this is a good one. I'm going to let you take this one too, Alan.
Okay.
How do you find the right kind of hosts to be successful with this format?
That's a little bit of a challenge. Some of them are currently in radio. As we know, there's some really good folks out there, but ultimately knowing what button to push next or how to talk up a post is not anywhere near the top of the criteria for people like this. So while some of them are in radio, if we keep looking in the same places, we'll find the same people all over again. So we have to look outside as well. You know, there's lots of people around with the right attributes, but you know, when you go outside radio, you've really got to be committed to coaching. You know, you should be committed to coaching anyway, but if you go outside the industry, you've really got to coach and develop and be willing to do that and invest in it. You know.
Good. I think I'll take this next one, Alan, although I'm sure you'll want to weigh in on it too. You said that 4 stations in Canada are all offering, I guess they mean all 4 stations in Canada that are doing this format are all offering some form of hot AC music. Do you think this format can work with other styles of music? Well, I think the first thing we should be clear about is our answers are not going to be based on research, because we just did research on this particular station
Right.
that offers the hot AC music mix. I think it is possible for the format to work with other music formats, but one thing to keep in mind is the point we made about how the music is what brings CUME into this format, and then the conversations help generate TSL.
Right.
So if you're going to take a different music mix than, let's say, hot AC, it needs to be pretty broad, or at least it needs to be pretty mainstream in its appeal in a market. So, you know, like I wouldn't build a station like this based on a niche music style. Certainly could see it working with like more of a more gold-based classic hits format, possibly. In a market where there's a huge appetite for country, maybe it could work with country, although I think there are some markets where there might not be a big enough appetite to sustain that. But I think it could, but we just don't have evidence one way or the other about whether it can do that. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that.
No, I think you're right. In an ideal world, since the kind of topics that you can deal with in this format cut across genders and ethnicities and cultures, you know, you can be a pretty wide radio station, and so you wouldn't want the music to narrow the audience more than you have to, but sometimes, you know, you have to narrow as much as you need to. And then in some situations, this could be, you know, we've talked about this could be a differentiator. You know, if you're in a market with 3 of the same thing and you're number 3, how do you differentiate? This would certainly do it. You know?
Right. Although I think the point I always like to make to people about this is you get too caught up in the differentiation, the conversations,
Right.
and you don't compete on the point of parity, the music.
Right.
You'll end up
Right.
with a pretty small position. I got a couple of other good questions here. You know, this is one I don't know the exact answer to. Maybe you do. And this is specific to Now in Edmonton. Does the station do any voice tracking, or is it live 24/7?
The station, to my knowledge, doesn't do any voice tracking, but they will repeat and share shows. For example, the Calgary station runs the Edmonton morning show at night, and there are some off-hour shows that get recycled, but no voice tracking to my knowledge.
Okay. Here's another good question. What sort of topics do the hosts tend to cover?
You know, they tend to be somewhat topical. You know, at least they might correspond to the season. But they're basically anything that starts with a good story and then might generate good stories from the audience. You know, two of my favorites were this spring during spring break in Canada, and I didn't hear the introduction of this, so I don't know what the context was, but the question was, how many kids have you ever lost track of? And the best answer on that one was a guy who called in and said that one afternoon, I think on a trip, he lost track temporarily of 150 kids. It scared him to death. The other one that comes to mind is, yeah, I don't know if you know Elton John, when he was coming into the U.S. for his tour this year, his plane had a problem and had to make an emergency landing in Nova Scotia. And so that kind of turned into what's happened to you on an airplane. And you know, I think one of the texts that came in was we were on a plane that had a bomb on it, but it wasn't discovered until everybody was off the plane. And then another story was this woman who was sitting back in coach. Stewardess came back and asked her if she would mind moving to first class, and she said, "Well, you know, probably not, but why?" And the stewardess told her that Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie were traveling with all of their kids, and they were and apparently Brad and Angelina were in first class, and the kids were in coach, and Brad and Angelina wanted to come back and sit with the kids. So at that point, the woman said, "No, I think I'll stay here." And the two people on either side of her said, "Yeah, we'll switch." So she sat between Brad and Angelina on her flight.
That's very funny. I think, you know, you're describing something that I think is an important differentiator about the personality content on this station versus what we traditionally hear on a lot of music stations.
Right.
With the utmost respect for most music station personalities, I feel like when you listen to most music station personalities, it's a performance. They're putting on a show. They've prepared bits, they've done all their prep, and they are performing for the audience. And that could be very entertaining and very compelling. When I listen to some of the better content on Now Radio, it's more like the hosts are like facilitators for the audience to respond to prompts they give them, and the audience actually puts on the performance. And I think that's a very interesting and compelling and differentiating aspect of this radio station.
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, it's Johnny Carson was funny, but he mostly became a star, and Kimmel and Fallon and everybody else do the same thing by letting other people have the stage and
Right.
being the host of it. So that's what these personalities do. But they have to, I don't want to say monologue, but they have to tell stories from time to time to start the conversation.
Yeah, great point. Here's another question that came in, and I'll kind of tell everybody we'll probably do this for another question or two. So if there's something really burning that you want to ask Alan and me, now would be the time to type it into the platform. On average, how long are the talk breaks on the station?
I think the right answer is only as long as they need to be, but they might be a couple of minutes, 2.5, maybe. It would be not an uncommon length.
Right, absolutely. And then here's just a question about our research. Did the respondents know the study was for social FM, and were they compensated? So they did not know that this was a study for social FM. Obviously, we asked them a lot of questions about social FM, but it started on a very unaided basis, asking people to tell us about what radio stations they listen to. But yes, they were compensated as participants in most quality research studies are. Not a lot of money, but they were compensated, absolutely.
And I think Warren also mailed them random items lying around his house too.
Yeah, and somebody also asked, was this study commissioned by Now? And we want to be very clear, absolutely not. Now is not a client of Coleman Insights or Alan Burns and Associates, but both Alan and I, along with some other people in our companies, have been watching this station from afar for a while. We've been intrigued by its success. Again, we think it might be a model for some of our other clients to be taking a look at. So we wanted to do some research on it to, gain some insights into how you can most be successful with the format. I think we've kind of covered all of these. Here's a good question that does relate to a client of our companies, and says, what operators in the US are doing anything like this? Is this like what KS95 in Minneapolis does? They are personality heavy with a hot AC format. I think we're talking about shades here along a spectrum, but without telling you things about the work we do with KS95 that are proprietary, I don't think it'll be surprising for anybody to understand that KS95's foundation has always been a music position, variety, that now has been complemented with a great deal of personality imagery as well. And I think where Now is a little bit different than KS95 is that Now's foundation consists of a blend of music and personality. Again, we're talking about, moving along a spectrum here, but, KS95 was first built on its music position and then added other layers to what at Coleman we call the image pyramid. Now's foundation started with this mixture of music and personality. I don't know if you have any other further thoughts on that, Alan, but that would be my take on that.
Yeah, and KS95, while for example the afternoon show involves listeners, generally, and I'll remove this a little bit from KS95, generally stations that have personality shows in the afternoon, it's personality centric. They're talking to each other a lot. On Now, the primary conversation is between the host and the listeners. And that may not seem like a big distinction, but it's important in that, and listeners feel this. Radio stations, many of them don't have very good listener focus. A radio station that's kind of built around conversations with the listeners is all about the listener, and that makes a big difference.
Right, and I think we should be clear, one's not necessarily better than the other. It's just important to understand that they're different. You can be successful with both approaches.
Right.
Okay, I'm gonna do one more question here because this is an interesting one that I haven't really given much thought to, but we'll wrap up with this question. We all know most calls on American music stations are canned or performed by voice actors from various services. Is your sense all the calls on this station, are they legit?
You know, that is proprietary information that belongs to the company that owns these radio stations, and
Yeah,
I don't know that they would be happy with me answering it. You know?
Okay, yeah, I don't know. That's I just hadn't thought about that dimension. That's a very interesting question.
It is a good question.
Yeah, I
you
will
can,
tell you, you know, as somebody who's been in this business for a long time, I can usually tell the ones that are, and boy, this stuff on this station feels very authentic to me, but I don't know the answer to that question.
very much so.
That would be a great question to ask.
Yeah.
If anybody knows the people at Pattison Media, you can talk to them and
right. But you're right. You know, generally when you have an actor playing the role of a listener, the audience may not be able to tell, but you know, people like everybody on this call can tell. You know, and I've never heard anything like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, great. Well, again, thank you everybody for participating in our presentation today. Again, the websites for both of our companies are on the screen, and we both have ways to contact us through those websites. If you have any additional questions that we didn't answer about this, we will do something with the recording of today's presentation and make it available for those of you who want to go back and watch it again or have other people in your companies view it. But we were really gratified by the response and the number of people who registered, and I can see a lot of people attended. So on behalf of Alan Burns and Alan Burns and Associates, and me and everybody at Coleman Insights, thank you for joining us today, and we wish you a good day. Bye-bye.
So long. So long.